Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm so grateful that you've chosen to spend some time with me as I talk about a first for me, which is the fact that for the first time ever, I have read a horror novel. This one was called The Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward. Let's talk about whether this was a terrible idea or whether it actually worked out for me. So I went into this book knowing almost nothing about it, and as with most books, I think that's really the correct approach to take here. I think you really should kind of go in knowing almost nothing. All I'll say from a plot perspective is that there is a young girl that has disappeared several years previously, and her sister, now that she's grown up, has really taken an interest in finding out what happened to her missing sister. Meanwhile, there are some rather strange things going on in The Last House on Needless Street, and that's really all I'm going to tell you about this one. The book is written from a few different points of view, and one thing that is clear immediately as you start to read the book is that some of these narrators are not reliable narrators. For instance, the first character we encounter is a man named Ted, and it's obvious that Ted is not a neurotypical individual. There's something going on with Ted that is outside of the ordinary, and what he's narrating is hard to make sense of a lot of the time. Now, he does have moments of clarity, such as this little statement he makes early on in the book when he says, "I judge people two ways, on how they treat animals and on what they like to eat. If their favorite fruit is some kind of salad, they are definitely a bad person. Anything with cheese, they are probably okay." So Ted here is an interesting individual, but it's clear that Ted has difficulty navigating the everyday world with whatever it is he's dealing with from a perspective of somebody who is neurodivergent. Now, the second point of view we get into is that of a cat. And it's funny that over the course of the past year, this is now the second book I've read that has a cat point of view, the other one being The Aeronaut's Windlass by Jim Butcher, where one of the characters was a cat, a sentient individual who could communicate with some humans. And in this story, we do have a cat who is expressing their point of view, and who also has some nuggets of wisdom, such as this one here. The cat, whose name is Olivia, says, "Anyway, the trick to life is, if you don't like what is happening, go back to sleep until it stops." So I kind of love the fact that we are looking at the world through the eyes of a cat, and we do see a cat on the cover here. And honestly, that was one of the draws of the book, was this little mysterious cat sitting in front of the house. But of course, you do wonder how reliable what a cat is saying is to the overall story here. Now, when we get to the third point of view, a lady named Dee, we finally feel like we're getting into somebody who is more of a reliable narrator. And Dee is the sister of the girl who had gone missing some years back. And she starts to develop some deep suspicions about our fellow Ted here. Now, one quote I enjoy from Dee is something that she says about books. Dee is talking about how there's only one book she ever reads, and it says, "She reads Wuthering Heights. She is only a couple of pages from the end. When she finishes, she opens the book at random in the middle and continues reading. Dee only ever reads this one book. She likes to read, but you never know what books are going to do to you, and she can't afford to be taken off guard. At least the people in Wuthering Heights understand that life is a terrible choice which you must make each day." You never know what books are going to do to you, which is why I've generally avoided horror. Actually, I never really did talk about that. I have mentioned previously that the reason I do avoid horror in general is sort of twofold. One, the fact that over 16 years of paramedic work, I experienced an extreme amount of real-life horror, which left me with crippling PTSD, means that when I am in my leisure time and my escapism, I don't want to go back to horror and have that as part of my experience away from work. Plus, the fact that all the horror that I've dealt with is real-life stuff where really I was in control. It was kind of up to me to deal with it and try to make some order out of the chaos that I was confronted with. The fact that this was all happening in real life where I was responsible, what is fictional horror going to do for me? How is that going to give me a thrill when I know it's all just kind of made up and pretend? So it doesn't really appeal to me at all. So that's generally why I have avoided horror altogether. Now going back to D, this statement made me chuckle too. The yellow-headed boy says, "Hi." She sees the swirls of white lotion on his pale skin. When he smiles, his front two teeth overlap slightly. It gives him a feral, intriguing air. Yes, so do mine. Does it give me a feral, intriguing air? That just made me laugh. Before I go on to the horror side of things and talk about what I thought about the book, let me just pause for a second to send out a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. In particular, I want to thank my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Paul, Mojo Dam, and Asmandus Pervect. Your support really means the world to me. It really does help me to keep going at a time when life has really been beating me down a lot, so thank you so much. Now, the horror aspects of the book, I should mention that there are trigger warnings, I would say, for child abuse and for suicide in the last house on Needless Street. And I'm kind of glad I didn't know that going in, because child abuse is one of my triggers. With what I experienced as a child growing up, it is something I'm very sensitive to and really have a hard time dealing with. So I'm kind of glad I didn't know about that going in. But as a result, it did mean that it was kind of an uncomfortable read, fairly unsettling. Really, much of the book was sort of an unpleasant read. A lot of it has to do with the child abuse. On the other hand, there is this air of mystery woven through it all, where you really want to find out what happened to this missing little girl. And so I think the unpleasant side is counterbalanced by more of a mystery that made me want to keep reading through the stuff that was making me feel uncomfortable. The book certainly does talk about how tough life can be. We see a couple of examples here. At one point the book says, young people feel pain intensely, I think, because they don't know yet how deep it can go. And as somebody who has experienced a ton of pain in my life, thanks to having Crohn's disease since I was a young child, I certainly had a lot of experience with pain from a very young age. And yeah, definitely even then I didn't know just how bad it could get until I was older. And in fact, things can get so bad that you're really largely beyond help, which is sort of where I've gotten to in my life with the trauma I've experienced, the physical illness of the Crohn's disease, the mental illness of the PTSD, and the fact that I've done tons and tons of therapy and nothing's helped. Things have only gotten worse. So when I read this chapter in the book, it sort of stuck out to me and resonated with me. One character is talking and says, I can give you the name of someone who can go over your medical history in detail, someone you can talk to about what happened. It's never too late. He sounds unsure, and I understand why. Sometimes it is too late. I think I finally understand the difference between now and then. Maybe some other time, I say. Right now, I'm kind of tired of therapy. I can really relate to all that much too well. Now, there's very little sort of grotesque horror in terms of visuals, I think. There is a little bit, and at one point in the book, somebody hangs themselves. Like I said, there is this trigger warning for suicide. And I know I keep coming back to this in the books I read, but whether it's a fantasy book that's talking about people getting killed and dying in various ways, or this horror book here, so many times authors can't get dead people right. And I'm like, I feel like they need to consult with a paramedic like myself to find out what it's like to deal with a dead body, for instance. I mean, I've dealt with so many dead bodies over 16 years, you know, at least a few a month over a 16-year period. It's a lot of dead people, so I kind of know what I'm talking about in that regard, even if I don't know what I'm talking about in most other things. And when it's describing this person who would hang themselves, it says the character's teeth bite the character's blue lower lip as if caught in a last moment of doubt. And somebody who's hanging doesn't bite their lip. Their mouth is hanging open. Probably a swollen tongue is hanging out of their mouth. In fact, in terms of all the dead people I've dealt with in all kinds of different crazy situations, pretty much The two most grotesque things from a visual standpoint are a grossly charred body, something that's been in a fire, and a hanging. Hangings are one of the worst things to witness from a visual perspective. The way the head and neck are oddly contorted, the fact that the face is this kind of mottled bluish purple, the mouth is wide open, the tongue is often hanging out, and just the overall look of a hanged person is horrible to witness, and I feel absolutely horrible for any family member who has found a family member in that situation, and just what a traumatic experience must be for them, seeing how bad it was for me as a paramedic who didn't know the people I was dealing with. But it is just one of these little details that, because of my experience, I pick up in books and go, well, actually, that's not quite right. So I mentioned that much of the reading experience of the book was fairly unpleasant, that there was kind of a sinister tone throughout the book as I was reading it. And there were definitely times where I didn't know if I really wanted to finish it and keep reading. But then I got to the ending and I was like, oh my God, this really blows it wide open. What the heck just happened? And it was the ending that just pulled everything together and turned it into just this amazing read. So I obviously can't go into detail because I'm going to spoil the entire thing. I can't go into any detail at all, really. All I can say is that the ending makes this book a very worthwhile read. It's one of those endings that makes you sort of flash back to the beginning and think about things in a new light, really. And it's one of those things that is going to put the reader into somebody else's shoes and provide some perspectives on things that they might not otherwise have. And that's all I'll say about that. It's one of those things that is worthwhile reading about. So after all that, I think the rating that I would give The Last House on Needless Street is 7 out of 10. Were it not for this amazing ending, it would have been a very low score because, like I said, much of the book was a little bit unsettling and unpleasant. But because of how everything wrapped up and was pulled together, I think a 7 out of 10 is what I would ultimately give this book. Does it mean I'm going to read more horror in the future? No, it does not. I have no interest in the horror genre. In fact, if it wasn't October, and I probably wouldn't have even picked this book up despite all the rave reviews I'd heard about it. But for some reason, this October, I was in the mood for something a little kind of spooky to go along with the season, even though I'm not normally a seasonal reader. But nope, I'm going to stick with my fantasy, my regular fiction, my non-fiction, and still, I think, avoid the horror genre. If you have read this book, I am really interested to hear what you thought about it. And if you haven't, I'm really interested in hearing what you are reading right at the moment. Please take a minute to chat with me in the comments. I love having these discussions with you. Thanks so much for your time. Hi, it's Josh here. Just taking a minute to ask you to push all the buttons. Push the buttons, like, subscribe, do the notification bell, all the stuff, all the buttons. Is a man, I'm pretty sure, in the sort of, so that's generally why I have avoided that is worthwhile